Hello and welcome to the John 3:15 podcast, the show where we break open the mysteries of the most popular and misunderstood Bible verses and put them back into context. I am your host. They call me Jonathan, Christmas Hymns Year-Round Van Shank, and here is my co-host. They call him Jeremy Post-Thanksgiving Swingle. Now, Jeremy, why do they call you Post-Thanksgiving Swingle?
Because it's a crime against humanity to sing Christmas carols in January or February or even November pre-Thanksgiving. And I don't understand what has gotten into you that you've been misbehaved to this level. Now, I will immediately admit my hypocrisy here because in our personal devotions in my family, we have... this year we have perhaps cheated a bit and may have started singing Christmas carols in like November 18th or somewhere around there.
Yeah, but that's practically Thanksgiving. I'm talking about like singing. I'm talking about singing Christmas hymns in like May.
Yeah, and that's like I think a war crime. Like I don't know. That's deeply offensive to me, and I think you should repent and believe in the gospel.
The gospel of Christmas hymns after Thanksgiving.
So, give an account for yourself. Let's hear it. Why is this okay with you?
Oh, just that Christmas songs, Christmas hymns are usually really, really great. And, you know, they have a great focus on the incarnation. And I think the incarnation is something that we should be thinking about and remembering year round. And so, like, what's wrong with bringing in a little bit of of the Father's love begotten in like May? It's a great song. And, you know, it's got all of the right kind of like beats and focuses, you know, on the incarnation and the work of Christ. And, you know, just because it happens to be a Christmas song doesn't mean we can like only sing it, you know, for 4 weeks out of the year or something like that. So I'm not saying that we should be like busting out Hark the Herald or, you know, something like that necessarily, but just that like, if I'm going to sing We Three Kings in May, I think that's okay. I think it's just a good song.
Okay, now I'm confused because I thought you were making a distinction there between like songs that are about the incarnation, but maybe more theological. They're not about the Christmas story as much. And so perhaps like we could sing one of those year round, which I would agree with that. There's some gray area. Is it a Christmas song or not? But then you brought up We Three Kings, which is like, I don't really even know how it gets more Christmassy than that's literally just like the Christmas story.
It's true, and it's one of the few actual Christmas songs, not Advent songs. You know, well, I guess there's a lot of Christmas songs, but like legit, full on in Christmas songs, not just like birth of Jesus kind of deals. You know, but I would say because like I mean, most of the content of We Three Kings isn't really strictly biblical. I mean, it's mostly theological in nature, where, you know, something like the first
there
Noel,
weren't even three kings. I mean, we debunked this all last year, didn't we?
Yes, it's true. and I guess I would say I'll back off of Hark the Herald. I said that, but what I was really thinking in my head was the first Noel.
That's just because you hate that song.
Well, okay, yes,
you're biased. True. You don't want it to even be busted out in December. So.
Yeah, that's true. It's just a bad song, but
I remain unconvinced, and I'm ashamed to be associated with you. But nevertheless, let's talk for a while about Romans 13.
Yes, that's right. So to our listening audience, we were finally tackling probably like the verse or one of the two big verses. There's another one in, is it 1st or 2nd Peter? I can't even remember off the top of my head.
The First Peter 2, you're talking about the fear God, honor the king.
Yes, yeah, that one, where it's like, so Romans 13 is like one of the two big passages that if you're talking about like, oh, politics in the Bible, it's like, Romans 13, that's the verse, that's the thing that you deal with there. And so, you know, it's taken us 2.5 episodes talking about theology and politics before we finally gotten there, but we're finally here, full-fledged episode 3 of our series on theology and politics, and we're tackling Romans 13 today.
Yeah, the passage in which we learn that we have to obey Hitler no matter what he says, right? That's
true. Yeah. I mean, that's just what Paul says, right? You know, don't you believe the Bible? No. Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely an element of Romans 13 where it seems like nobody actually nobody actually believes that Romans 13 means you should do whatever the government says, right? Nobody believes that. People say that as a club to wield against people who are disobeying government laws they like, right? Like, you know, Romans 13, obey the law, right? But sure, I don't think anyone actually believes that.
It's true. Well, it sounds like you're getting into some misconceptions here a little bit, Jeremy. So maybe before we get... It's true, but I want you to circle back to that one in just a second. But first, how about you read us our verse in particular? This is, you know, Romans 13, verse 1.
Yes, all right. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God.
So, I mean, there it is. It's pretty clear. We're to be subject to governing authorities. So, you know, if the government says it, you got to be subject to it, right? I mean, that's how it works, and that's what Paul is saying here, right?
And the passage goes on from there. We'll cover the whole section, but it goes on to say, you know, if you would have no fear of the one who is in authority, then do what is right, and you will receive his approval, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the avenger of God who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Mm-hmm. Right, which is even more strong language, basically saying, don't just be subject, but like if you're not, you're subject to wrath, right?
Yeah, totally. And you know, there's another verse that says, you know, the one who resists authority is resisting what God has appointed. So it's like, right? I mean, Paul is not mincing words in this section, that's for sure.
Yeah, so you better obey Hitler or you're disobeying God, right?
Right. Yes, and I think that's probably the misconception that
you
I think we really
supposed to say right.
No. Sorry.
That could be taken out of context. You could get canceled for that, man.
Oh, I mean, there's so many other things that I could be more easily canceled for that aren't out of context that I'm not worried about it.
Fair enough.
But I'd say, you know, getting into the misconceptions a little bit, I think that's the piece right there. Is the main misconception that like I think we see from this passage is that people will say that this is just some kind of like carte blanche authority that's being given to governments to where they can kind of just basically do whatever they want and you have to listen to what they say. And you know, and kind of what you're saying, Jeremy, is that like even though people say things like that, or that's kind of the core nugget of the argument that they're trying to make of, oh, you know, you Christian person, you have to obey this law or you have to obey this command that a government has given to you because Romans 13. And so kind of the nugget of the argument that they're making is Romans 13 just means you have to always obey the government. But I don't think you're like what you're saying. Nobody really actually thinks that because, you know, you can just immediately bring up some very clear counterexample of like Hitler. I mean, I think it would be, you know, even though I'm pretty sure there were Lutheran ministers in, you know, the 1920s or 1930s, 1920s.
There 100% were Lutheran ministers who were, you know, SS members secretly, or whatever, you know, who were saying use Romans
passages
13.
like this, to say, you know, you have to obey what the party says, right? You know, and so even though, you know, they're using that, I guess maybe what I would say is there are people who do mean that, like, who do interpret Romans 13 to mean you should always do what the government says. But I think most people realize that is just manifestly untrue in extreme cases.
Well, so then you get the more nuanced position. And by the way, I have to point out John's "Don't Tread on Me" mug, since it's very apropos to our episode, and he keeps brandishing it.
It's true. I'm drinking my nice peppermint tea here, so we'll get back to this flag at the end of the episode, I hope.
All right. So that being said, I think there's the more nuanced position, and this is what you'll hear from kind of the man. We've been so hardcore on these people lately, like the big Eva leaders, right? Big evangelicalism, the people who are invited to the conferences and write the Crossway books and stuff like that, right?
We've been hard on them, but I think it's because they deserve it.
Right. Yes. So the more nuanced position you'll get is like, well, okay, obviously we have tons of counterexamples like of civil disobedience in the Bible. You have the apostles saying, hey, we don't care what you say, we're going to preach the gospel anyways and throw us in prison if you want, right? And so, you know, someone who has a broader concept of the Bible but maybe still has kind of a a statist view of reality, or like a Romans 13 means you ought to obey sort of thing, would say, well, obviously we don't have to obey the government if it contradicts God, but if it doesn't contradict God, we have to obey it, right? And then once again, though, that quickly falls apart as soon as we start thinking about it a little more. So, okay, if the government says you have to balance a dozen eggs on your head every time you leave your house, and you have to do that the entire time you're away from your house, or you'll be fined $30,000. And if you drop the eggs, you'll be fined $50,000, right? And you got to balance this carton of dozen eggs, and you just have to do it. Why? Because we said so. Okay, well, that's not contradictory to anything in the Bible. Like, you know, there's nothing sinful about balancing a dozen eggs on your head. You can go to church and worship God balancing a dozen eggs on your head, right? So it's like, okay, so what do we mean by this whole, like, okay, until they tell us to sin, we obey no matter what? No, that's idiotic. Like, that doesn't make, like, no matter what they say, are you sure? And if the dozen eggs example sounds crazy, I mean, not to get too down the rabbit trail here, but the government has inflicted all sorts of ridiculous non-scientific measures on the people for the last 21 months that you can't point to a single statistic that demonstrates their efficacy. Like, so why are we doing this? It's about as pointless as putting a dozen eggs on your head, right? And this, don't worry, this episode's not going to be all about the coronavirus, right? Just pointing out that the government,
I don't know, Jeremy. I'm the one who wrote the episode. Maybe it is.
Okay, but my point being that if the government dictates arbitrary things, there has to be some point at which we say, even though that's not explicitly sinful, it's idiotic, right? And so we need to have some sort of theory for dealing with that. Anyways, that's my way of previewing that where we're going with this is that Romans 13 does not actually say you always need to obey the government until it comes in conflict with Scripture. But that being said, Romans 13 also does challenge us as libertarians, since we've made that clear in the series. There's definitely things in this passage that I don't like, that I know are what Paul is saying.
Right? yeah, totally.
So there's, that's not to say that this passage is like, you know, a anarchist creed or anything like that, right? Just that we need to have a balanced perspective, I think. So that's where we're going with this. I think that's the more nuanced misconception that we're going to tear apart. But then maybe also there's a little bit of a too much in the other direction, like radical libertarian approach to Romans 13. That's also a misconception, perhaps. So
yes, yeah, I think there's a corrective that we need to hear from this passage, and
very true.
I think we'll get into that in just a little bit here. But yeah, maybe as a way of transition there, Jeremy, why don't we jump into the text and start kind of doing our usual thing of looking at the context and seeing how we can bring that to bear to make sense of what Paul is really telling us in this passage here. So
the text, that sounds like the meat.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Is that what it's time for?
It's time for the meat.
I love how you can never do that without giggling.
I can't. I can't take it seriously. Yeah, one of these days we'll get like the sound effects back in. Now that we're not doing a lot of oh, okay, yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, Jeremy, you can just do our Foley work for us there.
Yeah. All right, so lay it on us. What's the context here?
All right, so we have come to Romans 13:1, and for those who know how numbering in the Bible works, that means that there is an entire chapter, and in fact 12 entire chapters that come before Romans 13:1, that I'm going to argue are going to have something to say about what Romans 13 really means in its context. And so in this case, we've talked an awful lot about the book of Romans in the past, particularly in our series on the Romans Road. And so I don't think we're going to do maybe too much rehashing of that, except to say that most of what we talked about in those episodes was about the first half of the book of Romans. So that's kind of Romans 1 through about 11-ish is sort of one major chunk of the book of Romans. But Romans 12 and onward, including Romans 13, is in this sort of second half of the book of Romans. And there's been a little bit of a change in tone, maybe would be a way that I would put it, that Paul is taking. So, Jeremy, do you want to maybe talk to us a little bit about Romans and the way that it's divided in two?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the basic gist of it is Romans 1 through 11 sort of comprises this extended theological argument. And we've gone through the ins and outs of some of the more prominent, well-known verses, of course, as you mentioned. And then, I mean, you've got like the intro to the letter, of course, but then around, I think it's 1:18, the meaty section from 1:18 to the end of chapter 11 begins. And obviously, it deals with Jews and Gentiles, salvation and all that stuff. And then verse 1 of chapter 12 turns it from a theological letter to a very ethical letter. He says, therefore, if I'm remembering it correctly, offer your bodies to God as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not conform to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So he switches the topic from, okay, since all this crazy stuff that blows people's minds happens for 11 chapters, since all that cool stuff happened, now what? What do we do in response? And Paul's response is essentially, obey God and live an ethical life, love one another, and be a good citizen, chapter 13, what we're getting into today, and consider one another in love, consider the weaker brother, and lastly, worship God, give glory to God, right? And so there's various little components to chapters 12 through to the end of the letter when Paul does his greetings, various ethical things, and by ethics here, I just mean like, how do we live in the real world, right? What is being a Christian and being a good neighbor? What does that entail to love God and love people? And so it's basically 5 chapters, or really 4 chapters, because chapter 16 is, like I said, the ending. So we got 4 whole chapters here just about that. And we're right in the middle of it.
Yep. Yeah, totally. And the way that Paul is kind of doing these, like, basically application points of, here's all your theology, and now here is how that should impact your life in the second half of the book, is particularly in the end of Romans 12, which is kind of the immediate context before we get to Romans 13. Paul does a series of exhortations to the believers in Rome. So an exhortation is basically just kind of like a short little tidbit of, hey, do this kind of thing, or don't do that kind of thing. They're kind of these general principles that you could live by.
It's like an encouragement and a command at the same time, right?
Yes, totally. And so, to get a sense of what we're talking about, I'm going to start reading here in Romans. We're going to pick up in verse 9, and then I'll just kind of read for a little bit, just so you can kind of get a sense of what the context sounds like. So, picking up in Romans chapter 12, verse 9, it says, "Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil, and hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, but fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." I'll kind of pause there for the time being. There's a little bit more that we'll get into in a second, but hopefully that gives you a sense of it. It's a bunch of these kind of small phrases of do this kind of thing, do that kind of thing, rejoice in hope, be constant in prayer, bless and do not curse, and kind of ideas like that. And so, and the thing that I'll point out is the way that this section begins, Paul actually kind of uses this as a little bit of a, I would say maybe a thesis statement or kind of a theme for what all of the exhortations that he's about to give us looks like. So it begins with this: abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. So it's kind of this idea of like cling to the good and reject the evil, or cling to the good and hate the evil is sort of the idea. And if you read through this section, and I encourage the audience to do this sometime, but read through the end of Romans 12 and just take a look at kind of what all of these commands are and see that they really do kind of fall into these categories of, hold tightly to this good thing. The idea is that it's not easy to be good, or to do these good things. You have to like really work at it, and that you should be, setting yourself against the easy or maybe more kind of like natural to yourself evil things. So one example of this would be, bless and do not curse. Let me actually see which.
Don't do the evil thing, do the good thing.
Yes, bless those who persecute you, and bless and do not curse. Exactly. So it's like, if someone persecutes you, it's easy to curse them. If like, that, terrible person, that's the easy thing, but it's also the evil thing to do. So set yourself against that and instead, cling to the the blessing. It's hard to bless people who persecute you, but it's definitely the good thing to do. And so, hold tightly to that. And so that's kind of the main sort of idea of what we're seeing right here in the context of Romans 12. And again, I think we're probably going to maybe jump through a little bit of these because there's a lot that's going on in here. And in fact, you have probably heard on the preface episode that we did here of, episode 2.5 of our, politics, where I actually, a sermon that I gave on Romans 12, where I really kind of go through a lot of these pieces and talk about it more deeply. And so I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that if, there's something that you're interested in there. But the exhortations that I really kind of want us to focus on come near the end, where near the end of this section. So in particular, it says, so I'll pick up in verse 17 here. So it says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so the thing that I want to highlight for you is there's a couple of these exhortations that Paul's focusing on that are really specifically about vengeance, where, he says, repay no one evil for evil. So, it's this idea of, don't take like petty vengeance on people who have done wrong to you. So if someone does something evil to you, don't pay them back with evil. It says, but give thought to what's honorable in the sight of all. So it's sort of this idea of like, conduct yourself above reproach. Don't get people back when they do something wrong to you. And in fact, this is actually kind of connected with what we were talking about in episode 2 of the podcast of Lex Talionis, where the idea. You mean
episode 2 of the series that we're doing, right?
Apologies. Yes, episode 2 of the series on Lex Talionis, where it's this idea that the law is to pay back people for, in kind for the wrong things that they do as a form of punishment. And that's sort of specifically instituted so that like there aren't these like cycles of revenge that happen. So it's not someone does something wrong to you and so you pay them back and then they pay you back and then you pay them back and then all of a sudden, both of your families are dead or something horrible like that. It's rather, the governing authority steps in and says like, okay, this person has done something wrong. And so, we'll go to a judge and they will, rule on our case. And, there will be some kind of like equal recompense that happens. And it's specifically to stop this kind of like paying back evil for evil. So kind of tying things in with what we've talked about before.
So like as individuals, so this is one of those places where someone might disagree with the point we were making in the last 2 episodes ago, because we had Donald on last time. So 2 episodes ago when we talked about this law of, executing murderers, right? They might point to this, repay no one evil for evil. And it's like, well, yeah, as an individual, yeah, we don't seek vengeance on people. But individual ethics is not the same thing as what the state ought to do, right?
Totally. And I would say specifically it's particular what Paul says, don't pay back evil for evil, which is not quite the same thing as having there be equal recompense for something. We would argue that justice is something that's good And so having someone who has done something evil being paid back with justice, that's not paying them back with evil necessarily. But yeah. I think that you do bring up a good point, and this is actually related to there are plenty of other places in the New Testament where this same kind of idea comes in. I'm thinking of especially of like the Sermon on the Mount of, if someone strikes your cheek, turn the other cheek also, this idea that you shouldn't be retaliating against somebody. So I think that is an important point that you bring up. But what I would say is that looking at the context of who these commands are being given to, they are specifically the individuals in the church community. So, it's things like, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, is one of the other exhortations. And I think it'd be kind of silly to have that be like, we should declare states of rejoicing for the whole community if, someone is rejoicing. It's like, no, it's very clearly saying if someone close to you is weeping or rejoicing, that you should be sympathetic to them in the place where they're at. Or, similarly, contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. It's like, those are both very obviously like things that I as a person do. I am contributing to the needs, or I am showing hospitality to someone. And so
presumably the church has, some sort of fund, like it mentions in one of the letters to Timothy, like for widows, right?
Yes, totally.
So it's like there's a structure and a institution that is doing something already, and you contribute to those needs, right? I mean, it can also just be an individual basis, right? But like there's ways to do that involve participation in institutions.
Yes. Yeah, totally. But that the...
Sorry, I'm kind of like interrupting you with all these ideas that
no
are
worries.
Probably, but it's like, I'm trying to bring, because this is what we're doing in this episode, is bridging the individual and the state in terms of, so that's like what's on my mind. I don't mean to keep interrupting.
No, please. This is great, Jeremy. I'm really enjoying this. And I think the thing that I would point out also is I don't think there's any way that this could mean, when it says repay no one evil for evil, there's no way that could mean that, we should never like have any kind of like community retaliation against people who do wrong, because Paul in like 6 verses is about to say that governing authorities are God's appointed like avenger to bring about his wrath against wrongdoers. So so I don't think that that's quite what Paul can mean in this verse. And so I think a more reasonable interpretation is that it's about our own petty vengeance, that I as a, I shouldn't just be going out guns blazing to avenge myself. Which is, in fact, what Paul says then in the next verse. He says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God." This is sort of the second exhortation that he gives us that's about vengeance here. And again, I would say the emphasis is very clearly on personal retaliation. It's like, don't avenge yourself. But then he goes on to say, like, leave it to the wrath of God. So, again, looping it in, that there is some kind of repayment or wrath or punishment that comes on wrongdoing, but it shouldn't be something that you as an individual are just enacting yourself. It's very interesting also, what I'll point out is this phrase, it says, leave it to the wrath of God. I don't know. I think that kind of sticks out to me a little bit, this idea that, avenge not yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. I think maybe some of the other trends, I think the ESV struggles a little bit in making it clear what's actually going on in this verse. If you look at some other translations, particularly I'm thinking of like the NASB or the NIV or the NRSV or, some of these ones, they translated of like leave room for the wrath of God. Or like the New English translation translates it like give space to the wrath of God, or give space for the wrath of God. And I think the kind of the picture here is that it's almost like there is this finite space in which, or this like finite bucket that wrongdoing creates, where it's like it can be filled up with wrath. Like there's a quantity of wrath that exists for wrongdoing. And it's like either it can be filled up with our personal wrath, like, us avenging ourselves, or it can be filled up with this quote, wrath of God. but that if we are like avenging ourselves, there's a sense in which we kind of like fill up that quota, and then there's like no space left for God's wrath to be, poured out on this wrongdoing.
And as we are about to launch into, that wrath can be meted out by the governing authorities. That can be how it's poured out.
Yes. And
which is crazy. So like, it's super related. Everybody kind of like, this is one of those chapter breaks. Everyone's like, oh, now Paul's talking about the government for no reason. And it's like, no, it's actually completely related to what he was just talking about. Like,
yes, yeah, no, totally. I'd say maybe an example of this that we could maybe get our hands on of, one of them, or this idea of like, personal vengeance not leaving room for the wrath of God is, again, one of the things we talked about in our second episode on politics, when we were talking about the Avenger of Blood, who, is chasing down. So, we use the example of there's Bob accidentally kills his friend Frank. I'm making up new names here. And then Frank's brother is is going to chase him down and try to kill him back. And so Frank runs to, or no, Bob. I'm so terrible at this with the names. Bob kills Frank. Frank's brother is now trying to kill Bob. So Bob runs to the cities of refuge. So hopefully this is people are remembering this one because it's complicated. And one of the things that it talks about is, you need to make sure that the cities of refuge are close together, so that, Bob doesn't get overtaken by Frank's brother on the road and having, Frank's brother then kill him. And because in that case, like, Frank's brother then is guilty of murdering Bob, that, like, there should have been a trial, there should have been, examination of the evidence to see if Bob had actually murdered Frank or if it was just manslaughter. And again, we kind of talked about this in the previous episode. But I think this is actually an example of it not being left to the wrath of God, that because Frank's brother is, avenging Frank in this case, it sort of like uses up the opportunity for Bob to actually be justly tried and to be, convicted and then, to have capital punishment, executed on him in a like righteous way that the law talks about. And so I don't know. Do you buy that, Jeremy, as an example for this, or do you quibble a little bit with my example?
No, I think it's a ripe phrase, and the example you gave falls within the purview of it, right? Like, sure. Even though we're going to be talking a lot about the punishment of the wicked and stuff in this episode, like as a personal thing, as Christians, to harbor these sorts of fantasies of vengeance is really a vile way to live, we might say, and very much against, even though it is acceptable for a Christian to be an executioner for the state. Well, okay, depending on the state you live in, right?
Maybe we'll get to that.
But let's like say you live in a reasonably well-ordered and just state. You're not in the Soviet Union. You're not in California, right? You're which they don't execute people anyways. But you're in a reasonably well-ordered state. You could be an executioner, right? Even though it is generally speaking not supposed to be the sort of thing Christians are fantasizing about or talking about or thinking about. It's like what Paul says, think about whatever's lovely, pure, and commendable. There's some people who need to do these sorts of jobs, perhaps, right?
No.
There's a distinction to be made here. I think it is what my point is.
Yes, and I think specifically the difference is whether or not it's your wrath or God's wrath that you are executing.
Oh yeah, good point.
So is it am I avenging myself? Is it my wrath, or am I executing justice? Is it God's wrath? That's actually being done. And the reason why I'm kind of bringing that up is I think it's really important that we connect this idea that God's wrath is something that like actually happens in time, in history, is executed by individuals. Because, like, at least for me, if I hear something like the wrath of God, I'm typically thinking of something that's more like end timesy, where it's like, this is the final justice that, God is going to, finally set the world right, or, something like that.
But even then, Paul says that we judge angels, right? Like, so even on that other side, so in this side, we have the judgment that comes from, say, a court system, right? And legal punishment for the wrongdoer. And actually, we're going to be involved in the eternal meeting out of that with Christ as we judge even celestial beings, right? Isn't that interesting?
Oh, yes. No, that is interesting. And I think that actually bolsters my point of
right.
That,
no, it does.
Like,
yeah.
that God uses intermediaries as the like means by which he executes his wrath or executes his justice. And so the point that I'm building to here is that the leaving room for the wrath of God is, I would argue, specifically in this case about temporal like wrath or like punishment for things that happen like today. In this case, like it would be specifically, someone being executed for a capital crime or something, or justly executed for a capital crime, or again, if like them having to pay restitution if they've like stolen something. That's closer to what's in view here, and the reason why I would argue that is because the alternative of this wrath of God being something that's actually more, kind of like final judgment-y, where it's, like cosmic justice that God is going to like execute in the end. I'm not sure that actually works in this case, because how could God's ultimate justice be like edged out by other evil that we do in the world today? So it's like, if like, say that it is the case that Bob did actually murder Frank, and then, Frank catches up with him and avenges him early, to use the previous example. It's like, I don't think that just because Bob was then wrongly killed by Frank's brother, that doesn't like get him off the hook for the fact that he did in fact murder Frank. It does mean that he was not he didn't receive God's wrath he didn't justly receive God's wrath in this world, but it doesn't mean that he's like off the hook for it. And so the like not leaving room for God's wrath, I think has to be something that's tied to this temporal world, because I think it's one of the main central arguments that like God's justice is something that is going to be enacted in eternity, that like no one is quote getting off the hook, like it is all paid for and all dealt with in the end, even if some of it doesn't get properly dealt with in this world.
So it sounds like you're saying that it's sorry, I sounded like Kathy Newman there, the woman who
so
interviewed Jordan Peterson. So what you're saying is, I'm not actually disagreeing with you though. So,
no worries.
So it sounds like kind of what you're getting at is that there's both a temporal and a eternal aspect to this, because even if it's not avenged by the avenger, which is the state, the governing authorities, right? Even if they don't get to it, it will eventually be gotten to. But one way or another, it will be gotten to. So it sounds like it's both temporal and eternal in the way you're arguing it. And I would agree.
Yes. Yeah. But that I think that Paul's main focus in this section is not on the ultimate justice, but on the temporal justice.
Sure, and that would be clear because of the fact that he goes on into chapter 13 to say what he says about
wrath, but I'm justifying those claims now.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, I'm on board. That makes sense
Perfect.
to me. As long as we're not like excluding the eternal aspect of it, because I think that has to be there too for it to fully make sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Nice one. So it says, avenge not yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. And then the next thing that Paul does is he gives a quotation. He says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." And the thing that Paul is actually Paul is actually making a quotation right there, and specifically he is quoting Deuteronomy 32, verse 35, if you'd like to follow along at home. Now, Deuteronomy 32 is a really long and complicated chapter, and so I'm not going to have us read it right now. Instead, I'm going to give a quick summary of what happens in Deuteronomy 32, so we can just maybe understand what Paul's saying and move on. And so that is Deuteronomy 32 is a section where it's in God's voice, where he is talking to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. And he says, in the future, you, Israel, are going to be unfaithful to me. Like, it's going to happen. You're going to go after other gods, idolatry. It's really bad. So you're going to be unfaithful to me in the future. And when that happens, I am going to punish you, Israel, for going away to other gods. And the way that I'm going to punish you is I'm going to raise up other nations and bring them in to basically destroy you militarily. Like that's what I'm going to do when you're unfaithful to me in the future. But then God switches and says, but those other nations, when they come and destroy you, are going to be arrogant about their victory. They're going to say, like, it was our greatness that caused us to defeat Israel, and aren't we so awesome? And so God is then going to turn around and destroy those nations for their arrogance. And specifically verse 32 or verse 35 is specifically God saying that of he says, those other nations are terrible and I'm going to destroy them for, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And so that's the particular quotation is specifically it is God saying that, you Israel, despite the fact that you were unfaithful to me, and despite the fact that it was, I'm the one who appointed these nations to destroy you, I'm still going to judge them for their arrogance anyway and destroy them nonetheless. And then, God goes on to, circle back around to Israel's unfaithfulness and talk about that more. And the reason why I think this is important is because for Paul's audience, they would have gotten the reference that he's making. Where, for us, we don't necessarily have Deuteronomy memorized, or, it wouldn't immediately oh, yes, of course, this is the section that it's talking about. And so when a Roman believer, one of the Roman Christians, when they would hear Paul making this quotation, it would immediately pop to their mind, all of these things. And so I think that what the quotation is serving in the flow of Paul's argument here is it's kind of doing a couple things. So in the first case, it's, I think, encouraging the Roman believers to actually be faithful to God. And so this is sort of flowing in with the, don't repay evil with evil, don't curse, bless, do that which is good, not that which is evil, because, God's going to hold you accountable for it. If God judged Israel for their evil, God can judge you for your evil too. So, be careful is one piece of it. And in fact, that's actually, this passage in Deuteronomy 32 is also quoted in the book of Hebrews, and that's exactly the way that the author of Hebrews is using this quotation in that context of specifically, hey, be careful, you believers, because, God's going to hold you accountable for the evil that you do, and if you're unfaithful specifically. But then I think it also kind of serves in the flip side as well to assure the Roman believers that God is in fact going to follow through with protecting his people. So, basically it's like God says to Israel that he's going to destroy them by using these people. And, that's what God did. But then he says, I'm going to follow up and then destroy those nations for their arrogance. And again, if you look in history, that's exactly what happened. Assyria comes in and destroys the northern kingdom. But where's Assyria today? They're totally gone. They've been destroyed. Same thing with Babylon. They carried off, the Israelites, but where's Babylon today? They're destroyed. And so even though God judges Israel, he does follow through with protecting, restoring Israel and destroying Israel's enemies. And so that's sort of the other piece of one, be careful, two, God does follow through with his promises. And I think kind of the final piece here is, kind of stitching those two ideas together is if God destroys Israel for their arrogance, when it was the case that Assyria was God's instrument for judging Israel, how much more is God going to destroy the enemies of his people that are just bad? They're not God's appointed, instrument of judgment or something like that. If they're just persecuting God's people, how much more is God going to bring to bear his wrath against these, evildoers, if they're not even his appointed instrument? And so I think if you bring the whole thing together, this is an encapsulation of the whole point that Paul's making. Don't do the evil things, do the good things, cling on to the good, because then if you are wronged, if evil is paid to you, God is going to give you justice. And that's kind of the main point of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a large theme of Scripture. So it's in accordance, right, with what else we know of Scripture.
Yeah. Well, you go ahead.
Well, no. So I was just saying, do we have any more of chapter 12 yet? Are we reaching the end of it?
Yes, so I mean that basically brings us to the end of chapter 12, or at least what we want to talk about. And we spent a long time kind of going through this section, and the reason why I wanted us to take that time to talk about it is because I think it really sets the stage for how we should understand God's wrath and the like good and evil when we actually come into Romans 13. So maybe if I could just give us a quick summary, and then we can come into our main section here. The first one is, it's really important to identify that this notion of God's wrath is, in the first case, something that like happens in time and is enacted by individuals. So it's like it's people who are enacting God's wrath. So this is the the idea of it's the state that's punishing people, or things like that. And that's really kind of the focus that Paul is bringing to bear here, that there are ways that God's wrath can be brought about in this world that are just and are righteous and are, in fact, the way that God wants it to be done. But there's also ways that wrath can be enacted in this world that are not good, that are, this is like our own petty vengeance, or us paying back people evil for evil.
Well, and if I could, so the term wrath in Scripture,
yeah,
so this is another one of those instances where we want to be careful of theologizing a term that's not necessarily a technical theological term. Mm-hmm. So, I think we've talked a lot in the past about the term salvation and how that's not a technical term. It's just it's a Greek word, right? And so because we're so used to hearing the word salvation in a technical sense, sometimes we don't understand the sense of it in Scripture. Yeah. And wrath is the same thing. It just means anger. It's not always talking about eternal punishment of the wicked. It does mean in this context it does mean punishment. That's true. I just think it's important that we don't overinterpret the word.
Yes.
And I'm looking it up in Greek now just so I make sure I understand which word it is. Orge. That's the word for wrath. And it just means, it's used of anger generally, So let's just keep that in mind.
Yes.
It's kind of a strong term for anger, granted, but it is sometimes translated as just anger.
Yeah, totally. And so that we should be careful that we aren't applying I was talking about this in some kind of cosmic justice, eternal punishment of the wicked sort of idea, that is a thing, but I don't think that's really the main focus of what Paul is talking about here, that he's really talking about something more specific, more temporal, that's really just kind of temporal, I'd say temporal punishments for sins, but that means something a little bit more specific if you're a Catholic.
That's also a technical term.
Yes, I was not meaning that in a technical sense, but... but yes, but the punishments for sins, which are temporal, I'll say it that way, so that it's it's not the special phrase. And so that's one piece, and then the second piece is highlighting the pairing of good and evil, so that we should cling to the evil and reject the good. And the reason why I bring that up is that Paul has been talking about this idea for a number of verses before he gets into Romans 13. And that Paul means something very specific about those goods and evils that we should be doing. And a lot of it really has to do with just being a good community member. So it's things like living in peace with people, being a peacemaker, or it's being sympathetic to the needs and experiences of the people around you, or it's things like being hospitable. So it's that there is something very specific about what being good or clinging to good means in Paul's mind as he's kind of going through this section here. And a lot of it, again, like I'm saying, has to do with just being a good neighbor, being a good citizen, being the kind of person that other people want around is kind of maybe the way that I'd put it. And that's not exclusively what he's talking about, but I mean that's the main thrust of what he means in the end of Romans 12 at least. And so with that, I think that sort of summary then brings us to the verse that we started with in our discussion. So Romans 13, verse 1. And so we come back to let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God.
Including Hitler.
Yes. So that
well, yeah, that wasn't me giving a misconception. That's actually literally.
Totally.
That's what it means.
The thing to notice is one of the huge points that Paul makes in the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans is that, like, God has his sovereign prerogatives to establish the world exactly the way that he wants it to be, and that he is in control of the things that happen. I'm thinking specifically of this as like Romans 8, where it says that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. Or in Romans 9, where God, talks about preparing, some vessels for destruction and some vessels for honorable use. I'm not getting that quotation exactly right. I apologize.
Like you mentioned earlier, the raising up of nations to judge other nations, even though it was wicked.
Yes, yeah, totally.
Even though it was wicked for the nation to do what it did, it was actually in God's sovereign providence that he raised up the wicked nation to punish his own people for their own sin, right?
Yes. And so it totally is in line with Paul's previous theology, and I'd say even just broadly the theology of Scripture, that when God that the people who are in power right now are there because God has appointed them to have that power. Again, like you're saying, whether they're good people or bad people, they are in authority because God has put them there.
Right. Yeah.
The other point that I would make about this is connecting back to the first episode that we actually did, talking about politics, and that was we were looking at what different kinds of authority structures there are, of like husbands and wives, parents and children, masters and slaves, and governments and those who were governed, or and also elders and congregants and things like that. And one of the points that we made there is, in all of those cases, those authority structures are derived authority structures, that there's nothing like intrinsic to the like elder that makes them an authority person, but that like they have authority because God has given them authority. And so ultimately it's God's authority that is then mediated through an individual into the world. And that's exactly the point that Paul is making right here, that he is saying, there is no authority except from God. And so those that exist have been instituted by God. So the appointed rulers, the reason why they have authority is because it's derived authority from God, not that this governing authority or this state or this government or whatever in and of themselves are just, it's not that they have the authority, it's they have been given this authority from God.
And I mean, I'll just highlight that, because that might seem kind of obvious to us, but I mean, not to people in the ancient world. They literally worshipped their pharaoh as God in Egypt. And there was even, a divine right of kings kind of take, even post Christ in Christendom, which, at times bordered on, if not crossed the line into just straight up, like, I get to make the rules because God told me I get to, right? This sort of might makes right approach where I'm divinely appointed. So it's not a given and obvious to all people that that's the case, right? That it's a derived authority. Only kind of with hindsight, perhaps we know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So maybe kind of moving on, so let's just keep kind of stepping through Romans 13 and maybe make some observations, and then at the end we can maybe summarize again and talk about perhaps some examples or make some applications. How does that sound, Jeremy?
Sounds good to me.
All right. So we just got this verse of for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. The next verse 2. How about actually you read this for us, Jeremy?
Yeah, let's see. Sorry, I'm scrolling up to the passage.
Oh, no worries.
Oh, were we going to talk about the the argument that verse 1 is like this passage is not original to Paul?
Oh, okay. Well, how about you give us the you give us the pitch for that, Jeremy? So
I think we got to talk about that.
okay, yeah, we'll take a second and discuss it, because I think that's worthwhile maybe for our audience.
Yeah, so some people argue that this passage is such an interesting departure from what Paul was just talking about, that clearly this must have been a later addition and it wasn't original to Paul's letter, right?
So this would be like some scribe, 150 years after Paul or something like that, is making his copy of the book of Romans and just inserts these 7 verses or so, right into the middle of the, what was just chapter 12.
Precisely. And I'm not going to mince words. It's just an idiotic argument. It's so idiotic. For one, we've already demonstrated with, we don't have PhDs in the Bible, and we just demonstrated that there's actually quite a big connection between these two ideas. So there's that. But also, number 2, there's no textual evidence of this. We don't have manuscripts omitting this section. It's not a thing, right? There are sections of scripture where our best manuscripts do omit things that are in the King James version, which was translated from the Textus Receptus. So that's things like, for example, in your modern Bibles, you will see the story of the woman caught in adultery who Jesus forgives in John 8. You'll usually have some brackets around it and a footnote saying this wasn't probably original to John's gospel. So there are sections where that is a concern. But
so
there's typically
textual
evidence. There's textual evidence for it. This is not the case with Romans 13.
So to highlight that for people, in the case of the woman caught in adultery, we have copies of manuscripts that, basically just you have the book of John and you're reading through it, and it just doesn't have those verses in it. It just skips straight over them. And we have a copy of that manuscript that has that in it. And then
we have a lot of them, and they're early manuscripts. They're reliable,
Right. And then we also have tons of manuscripts that do, in fact, have that section in. And, and so you could make an argument that because, maybe this, section was inserted by a later scribe, or, whatever your theory is. But at the very least, you actually have manuscripts that don't have the section in there. And so it's not, on its face absurd to suggest that maybe this wasn't in there originally. Contrast that with the book of Romans, where we have literally no manuscripts that don't have Romans 13 in it, but have all of the surrounding verses.
It's just pure conjecture. It's just making crap up.
Yeah,
it's not scholarship. And this is the problem. There's a scholar I highly respect, Gordon Fee. I'll name drop him, just because I really do highly respect him. But he made the argument that 1 Corinthians 14 verses 34 and 35 were not Pauline. And those are the verses that say women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must remain in submission. And Gordon Fee is, somewhat of an egalitarian. I don't think feminist is the right word, because that would make him sound like a contemporary intersectional feminist, which he's clearly not. He's a conservative guy on most issues. But on this, he believes in women pastors and all that stuff. So he, argues that that's not Paul, right? And it's dude, there's no manuscripts that omit it. There's a few, I think, that swap it to a different area, which can be evidence of manuscript errors, but in this case, it's there's no manuscripts that omit those verses. So anyways, I just think this is something scholars do when they don't know how to explain a text in light of their theology, and rather than figure it out, they just, oh, well, maybe Paul didn't even write it. And I find it so revolting. It's just such an abuse of scholarship. It's not scholarship. Again, by a guy who's otherwise really good, but Paul clearly says something that contradicts his worldview, clearly, right? And he's just well, it's not Pauline. I think it's stupid. I think I've made my point on it clear, but this is very much the same. Look, as a libertarian, sure, it would just delight me to get rid of this passage. Then I don't have to think about it. But that's
right. Yeah.
I could get rid of all that cognitive dissonance. but I'm not going to do that because it's obviously written by Paul. So, like, I don't know. That's just my 2 cents on that. Drives me up the wall when scholars do that. If you ever thought you need to listen to biblical scholars and you just need to trust them and take them at their word, never do that. That's the absolute worst way to read your Bible.
Yep. Well, there it is, folks. You heard it here first. Scholars perpetrate the most egregious crimes against the scriptures.
And they're also great when they're great. You have to, keep your brain on. That's all.
Yeah, there we go. Which, I mean, is probably just a good principle for most things, whether it's, whether you're listening to a Bible scholar or a pastor or, even us. It's like, you should keep your brain on. Like, don't just take our words for it.
Okay, so that rabbit trail aside, now that we've decided we actually do need to care about what Paul says here, because it is what Paul said. Verse 2, you asked me to read it. I shall read it.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment.
So, this one's really interesting, right? Because on first read, this one seems to be like also really straightforward. That it's like, yeah, like you have to do what the government says, and if you don't, God's gonna judge you. Yeah, I mean, like, I could see how people just like reading through it might kind of come to that conclusion, but I guess I think it's really interesting the specific phraseology that Paul uses in this verse. And, I need to be careful that I'm not like trying to explain away what Paul is saying or something like that. But I do actually want to highlight this and have us talk about it a little bit. The first thing that I would say is the phraseology is resisting the authorities. And it says that, they're resisting what God has appointed. Now, Paul doesn't say, like, he doesn't like explicitly say, whoever resists authority does a grave evil or, something like that. It's particular what he's saying. It's resisting what God has appointed, and that those who resist will incur judgment. But it is the case that Paul has just said that, like, all governing authorities are those that have been appointed by God, and clearly some governing authorities are good and some governing authorities are bad, just sort of in an objective sense. And so, it's saying that it's like, you certainly are resisting what God has appointed, but I think that's maybe more of a derived feature of the fact that, like, the authorities are there because they've been appointed by God, and so clearly if you're resisting them, you're resisting what God has appointed. I don't know.
Yeah, so Bonhoeffer,
how does that land for you?
Bonhoeffer, when he refused to go along with the Nazi Party, again, I mean, I know we keep bringing up Hitler, but it's apropos to bring up the most extreme example, right? Bonhoeffer, when he resisted the Nazi Party because of his Christian faith, was resisting what God had appointed. Clearly, because God has appointed and instituted every authority that exists. Paul made that very clear. And I think in this case, all does mean all. Every does. I do think in context, like, that's what he means. Because literally everything is under God's sovereign hand. So yeah, like, resisting Hitler is resisting what God has appointed. That doesn't make it sinful. Like, Paul doesn't say that, right? I think what he's saying is, like, be cognizant that you are resisting the person whom God has in his sovereign will, given a lot of temporal power, like the power to kill you, the power to kill your wife and children, or to send your children to war, or take all your possessions and property. I mean, governments can have a lot of power, right?
And they've been given that power by God, like,
Yes, even, if we're talking in a sovereignty sense, right? Not necessarily an ethical, moral sense. God doesn't approve of evil governance, but he does, in his decree, allow wicked rulers to be raised up, according to Romans 9, so that he can strike them down and display his glory in their defeat, right? Mm-hmm. So I would just say, like, if you are resisting what God has appointed to resist the Nazi Party. and you are doing the right thing also. Which might sound a little funny to people, but I don't think Paul would disagree with anything I just said. I think that's the exact logic of this passage.
Right. And I totally agree. And someone might say, well, but the next phrase says, but those who resist will incur judgment. So isn't that like saying then that, you're going to be judged by God for resisting what he's appointed?
No, it's saying you're going to be judged by the governing authority for resisting the governing authority. Because judgment, just like wrath, is not always a technical theological term for eternal judgment. It's just a Greek word, like
right.
So
and it doesn't even say that you're going to be incurring God's judgment. It just is, judgment. And so you have to do a little bit of inference to figure out, well, whose judgment are you incurring by resisting authorities?
Obviously the authority's judgment. And if the authority is being just, then you will also incur God's judgment in the next life.
Right.
So, and that is a big part of this passage. We're going to get to in a couple of verses. I don't want to spoil it.
Yes. Yeah, no, totally. And so I think that the interpretation that we can give to this verse, maybe kind of moving forward, is something like that of it's closer to an acknowledgement of saying, resisting authorities it's poking a bear. Like, I mean, these like authorities, they really are powerful people, and they're powerful because God has made them powerful. And if you resist them, like you are going to be incurring their judgment, their wrath against it. And if it is the case that they're good rulers, it's just. And, and if they're bad rulers, maybe it's not just the punishment that they're, rendering to you. But that doesn't change the fact that you're getting punished anyway.
For going against the authorities, right? It's the natural order of things. Whether right or wrong, Paul's describing the world as it really works. Mm-hmm. If you want to incur judgment from the current presidential administration, there are lots of righteous Christian ways you could do that.
Right.
Like, so just, I think that's important to keep in mind. And nevertheless, they are appointed by God. Right.
Yeah.
Like Christian, I don't know, who has a very triumphalist view over the government, perhaps myself, right? It's like, yeah, right. but they are an authority over you. It's kind of like the whole, like, also the not my president thing when Trump was elected, to kind of put the shoe on the other foot a little bit. It's like, well, yeah, but he is though. Like, sorry, like just in reality. And I mean, look, you can ignore his existence. I actually think that's probably the smart thing to do.
But it's like, but the man was definitely sitting in the Oval Office. Like, he was like signing papers and stuff, had the letterhead and everything, right? Like, I mean, there's no getting around the fact that he like very clearly was the president.
He is factually the president, and you got to cope with it one way or another. And then it's like, now the shoe's on the other foot. Both of the last two presidential elections have been, seen as stolen, right? And regardless of the veracity of either claim, right? The fact of the matter is, it doesn't actually matter whether it was stolen from a God sovereignty standpoint. It does from an ethical standpoint, right? We might care whether it was stolen or not, but at the end of the day, Biden is in the Oval Office, okay? And God help us, Kamala is going to be there when he bites the dust. It doesn't matter if it was stolen ultimately. Like, sorry, they won one way or another, ethically or not.
And those who resist will incur judgment.
Whether right or wrong,
Right.
So that's my little like dig there at both kind of sides, right? It's like, doesn't really matter if the election was stolen or not. I mean, it does, but it certainly does. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should not care if it was. It's just like, at the end of the day, God granted them power. Right? So unless you're going to overthrow the government, which I don't necessarily recommend, that might go bad for you.
It'll probably go very badly for you.
Probably go very poorly for you. They are, in fact, the president.
Right.
So it's I don't know.
But lest we maybe hit the side of this whole argument that's saying like, well, it's not like always wrong it's not like always sinful to resist governments. I'd say I think the vast majority of cases where one would resist the government probably are wrong. For instance, like resisting the government in the sense of like, well, no, I am going to go steal that thing. Well, no, I am going to go, vigilante, kill that person because of the wrong that they did to me. Like, totally is resisting the authorities if there's like laws against those things. And that's all like definitely wrong and evil. And so I guess I would say maybe to make sure we don't go too far out into the extreme edge cases, I think the vast majority of the center of this really is that there a lot of times is alignment between like the will of the government, which I mean primarily is for maintaining civil order. I mean, unless the government is self-destructive, like I mean they want to maintain an orderly like community, basically, that frequently that like that maintenance of order is something that is good, and our resistance of that would be bad. I think that that's kind of the majority of the case. And I'll
even North Korea has laws against murder.
Yes, and it would be wrong to resist the North Korean government by murdering your neighbor
in that particular instance.
Yes,
it would be wrong to resist.
Very specific instance. And so again, it's like, and I would say the vast majority of things that are resisting authorities are in that category of actually wrong kinds of things. We just typically don't, if you've like grown up being conditioned to be a moral person, it just wouldn't like necessarily occur to you to do those kind of resisting behaviors, or it just wouldn't be a thing that you do. Like, it's not like something that I'm just like constantly contemplating murdering people, but I'm like, oh shoot, no, that would be resisting the authorities.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, and the reason why I kind of bring up that point is because then when we get to verse 3, Paul, has this to say. He says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad." And so now Paul is actually bringing in specifically moral language, that it's not just like resisting authorities and incurring judgment, which, I'd argue is not intrinsically moral per se, but this one definitely is moral, the argument that Paul's making of, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. And I would also say that this loops us in with chapter 12, because we have previous definitions from chapter 12 of what Paul means by good conduct and bad. It's specifically that clinging to the good and resisting or hating evil. And like I was saying before, that a lot of these things really are like being a good community member, of, being hospitable to people, or taking care of the poor saints that are around you, or making peace with your neighbors and things like that. And so in that context, it's like, hey man, if you're trying to like promote a community that's like orderly and peaceful, it's like, I mean, what ruler is going to be a terror to that kind of good conduct?
Some are.
Okay, sure.
Let's put a pin in that.
Okay, yes. Okay.
We can talk about that in the other meet.
Right. Yeah. We will get around to that. But I think but I think this is the point that Paul is making of, it's like, come on, like what ruler is going to be a terror to you being like, I want to be hospitable to my neighbors and take care of the poor around me, and like ensure that I like have peaceful relationships with the people around me. It's like, no, they're going to be like, oh great, this is a person that I'm not like, going to need to keep track of and make sure they're, going to be like toppling me or something like that. Like, they're not a threat to me as a ruler.
Yeah, I think this section is difficult for me. This is the verse that I actually find the hardest to interpret, simply because Paul states directly, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Because that's just factually wrong when taken out of context. Like, and obviously,
yes,
I believe in the inerrancy of scripture, okay? But like reading it and taking it at its most face value, that's just literally, how could you even say that? Like, Paul, you're not an idiot. I mean, Hitler hadn't been a thing yet when Paul was around. But dude, like, he was well aware that the Romans crucified Christ, okay? The government crucified Christ. Like, yes. So how could you say this? I think the way that, I'm curious to hear your take on this, because this one sentence and the following thing is, do what is good and you will receive his approval. I mean, that's just not the case, right? The way that I have taken it and understand it to be is Paul is describing kind of perhaps a general, or even we might say ideal situation. And he's not here giving a complete comprehensive portrait of the Christian's relationship to the state, right? He's presuming that his readers have some sort of understanding of like Daniel and his friends, going against Nebuchadnezzar, and, they know the stories of the apostles. Paul himself disobeyed the government a lot, right? And just, and then of course Christ himself being crucified. I just think Paul is saying this in a context where he knows his readers are well aware of that. They're experiencing sporadic persecution, from the government. And so I think he's stating something general and or ideal, right? Like, even in this state that can be very wicked against us, the Romans still keep order, right? They built the roads, right?
Right.
The Pax Romana, they keep order. Now, they might be vicious to us at times, but like, this is still something instituted by God that does good things in the world despite its many issues, And so that's kind of how I would take it. I'm curious what you think.
Yes. Well, maybe let's just read I'll read these couple of verses just so it's in people's head, and then I'll give my take, because I'm not sure I totally agree with you.
Okay, good.
On
I'm curious. I'm not super satisfied with that way of understanding it. Right. I think it's kind of like iffy. So
yeah, I'd say so. Verse 3. So, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So I think that really what's going on here is, again, like I was saying, I think we need to understand the good and the bad that are in this section in light of Romans 12. And this is sort of the pitch that I was just giving, where it's that the good and the bad that Paul was talking about before is mostly having to do with having like peaceful and non-toxic relationships in your community. That's a lot of what the exhortation is about. And so I'm not sure that it's so much that Paul is talking about an ideal case, but that he's talking about a normative case, where it is that, going on in the background is like, what is it that the ruler really wants? It's, usually to maintain their hold on power is like fundamentally what the ruler, the person who's in authority, wants. Is, they don't want to be displaced, they don't want to be overturned, they don't want to be toppled. They want to kind of like maintain their position, perhaps expand it as well. And so if you're looking at what is it that the ruler then wants from citizens or from subjects, is basically like them to not be threats to their authority, and maybe to pay them taxes or things like that. And so the kinds of people that those rulers would be approving of or rewarding or giving this approval to are the kinds of people that are maintaining the community structure that they rely upon to maintain their rule. And so I think that's really kind of what's in the main focus here. And that principally the kinds of things that rulers want is, I don't think rulers want people behaving in immoral ways generally. It's even if you have so hear me out. Take the worst case of, someone who has power in a community, like a mobster or something like that. Like, the mobster doesn't want, shop owners going around and killing people, because the mobster is the one who wants to be going around and killing people.
Actually, there's lots of communities where they think fondly of the local mafia. Like, that's a thing.
Yeah, sure, because they keep order, right? And so in that case, it's the state or the ruler doesn't want people running around avenging themselves or paying people back or doing these kinds of things, because, in just a very pragmatic sense, they're the ones who want to maintain the monopoly on force. That's just sort of the way that it is. And so in the context of Romans 12, Paul is saying, don't do these evil, terrible, toxic things. Do these like good, positive for your community kinds of things. Like basically be the best kind of citizen, the best kind of member of your community that you can. Because like that's exactly what the ruler wants. Like even if the ruler is evil, they don't want you to be evil. Or they, like I'd say normatively, even if a ruler is evil, they don't want you to be evil per se.
Okay, so
they would still rather you be good. So
far, I agree with everything you've said, but I would point out something interesting because I also think I'm still right. Okay, so here's how I'm trying to work it through. I find it interesting that you said, and maybe you don't remember, but you said specifically that generally, you use the word generally, governments don't want people to be, going around doing these things.
Yeah.
Which is I think a correct statement, and also only correct generally, because we are living right now through a government that actively encourages and desires chaos, right? So, and that's kind of what I want to talk about later. I don't want to get derailed from the passage, but the concept of Anarcho-Tyranny, which I hope we can chat about.
Yes.
But so we'll get there. So I would say, I find it interesting though, you use the phrase generally, you use that word, and that was my whole point, is that Paul is speaking generally, right?
Like, well, no, because your point was Paul was speaking ideally.
Well, and I said I was undecided between the two,
okay.
And maybe it was a little bit of both, and I actually am still kind of there.
Okay.
But I also think what you said is correct, but I don't think they contradict.
Okay,
if
sure.
Okay.
I think I'm just more on the pragmatic side of the interpretation of it, maybe.
Sure. And you're not done yet. I think I did kind of jump in there, so keep going.
No. I mean, I was kind of toward the end, and then this notion of like them not bearing the sword in vain and being God's servant and the avenger to carry out God's wrath on wrongdoers is exactly that point of, even if the ruler themselves is evil, if they are doing things to punish evil, like punish the evil of their citizens, they are still fulfilling God's appointed role for them of like carrying out his wrath on wrongdoing. Because, before we were, it's the vengeance is mine, I will repay, is what the Lord says. And it's like, and in that context of Deuteronomy 32, he's talking about using Assyria to punish Israel for their wickedness. And Assyria was manifestly in like evil, like is like Sargon and Sennacherib, like were manifestly evil people in what they did, but they're still served God's appointed purpose of enacting this wrath against Israel for their sin. And so in to use that idea here, that it's like the ruler doesn't need to be good to still be appointed as God's servant to carry out his wrath against wrongdoers. And I guess that's the point that I'm building to with that and summarizing that is it's this general principle that usually like the thing that rulers do is like they want people who have these who develop peaceable communities. And, they don't want the kind of people who don't do the peaceful things, and they want to punish people who do evil things. Again, even if they're evil, because they want the monopoly on the evil and the force. And so they're going to, bring the hammer down on you, even if it's hypocritical. And by doing so, they are fulfilling God's purpose, whether or not they're good or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. I'm on board.
Okay.
And I think to add on to the idea of like generally, right?
Yeah.
Even in a broken system, it is probably the case that most of the people responsible for law and order in your local community, like, genuinely want to just keep order, right? Like, it's maybe not if you live in Seattle, right? But if you live like where I do in Snohomish County, it's a different world than King County, and it's especially a different world than Seattle. It's a short drive away, but like, I don't know, it's got a lot of issues, but generally speaking, I bet you talk to the average policeman here, right? And their motivations would be quite pure. Right. We're not talking about like deep levels of corruption, even if there's broken things about the system. You talk to the average judge in the courthouse here in Everett, which is just a few streets down from where I live, like they probably have the best of intentions, right?
Right.
And in many cases, accomplish justice. I served on a jury last year, and I think we made the right decision, and the judge was fair, and we enacted justice on somebody who deserved to incur the judgment of the state. It wasn't a petty white collar crime or some stupid thing. It was, he assaulted a child, right? So yeah, I think that was an example right in my neighborhood here of incurring judgment and being a terror to bad conduct, even in this system that I would say is not very amenable to my overall perspective. They certainly kept order in one significant way,
right.
Punishing somebody who harmed a child. And so, yeah. Now, again, as I kind of commented, cities are sort of not that way anymore.
Yeah, not all cities.
But, I'm thinking of the larger metropolitan areas and stuff. But still, generally speaking, probably the vast majority of this country, just speaking of land, is being governed by people who earnestly care. Most of the people, whether they make a ton of mistakes or not, they're not trying to be a terror to bad conduct. Or to good conduct, I mean. They're trying to be a terror to bad conduct. And in many cases, they succeed at it. Despite how much I might not like them. Right. So that's where I have to jump in and say, my personal opinions notwithstanding, still in God's providence, they are in fact carrying out the wrath of God on the wrongdoer.
Right.
Which makes this passage generally true. Right? Yeah.
And I would say that if they don't do that, if they don't carry out God's wrath on the wrongdoer, then that's basically how you get societies dissolving. That's the descent into utter chaos that just undoes the whole thing, is when rulers stop being a terror to bad conduct and start being terrors to good conduct.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Anarcho-Tyranny.
Yes. Yeah. So great. Well, I'll tell you what. So now that I've convinced you and I've gotten you on board, which I'm very happy about, let's do our last verse and maybe make a few comments about it, and then we can sort of wrap up and go on to some higher level discussions. How's that sound?
Perfect.
So verse 5 says, "Therefore one must be in a subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience." Now, this, I'd say first observation is that this is a bit of a summary verse. So Paul was talking about a thing and he's saying, now, therefore, looping back around to before, one must be in subjugation. And then he gives sort of the two summary statements, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. There's kind of two reasons why we should be in subjection to ruling, to rulers, basically. Now, before we dig into it, one thing I'm going to say is I think the ESV actually has a really bad translation here.
Say it ain't so. Betrayed by my elect standard version.
I know. The ESV usually does a great job, but in this case, it really doesn't. And that is because it says not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So it puts the word God's in there. And the reason why I would say that this is a bad translation is because this is totally like a interpretive liberty that the ESV translators have taken. The actual Greek that's in here, which I know not because I read Greek, but because I've read people who do read Greek, and so we'll need Jeremy to fact check me on this one. But the actual Greek here just says its wrath. So it's not only to avoid its wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So the Greek doesn't say God's. It's just this impersonal possessive pronoun its. And so it's incumbent upon then the translator to either just render it, I would say, ambiguously of its, or to make a decision about who the its actually refers to. Because in this case, it's it could be God's wrath, because, God is part of the sentence of therefore one must be in subjugation not only to avoid God's wrath, but it also could be the rulers who it's their wrath. It says, therefore one must be in subjection not only to avoid the ruler's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience.
Yeah, so I actually will have to correct you a little bit. It doesn't change the point substantially, but there isn't a possessive pronoun here. It's just
there isn't. Okay,
it's just tain or gain, which is the wrath. Although,
it's just...
yeah, unless there's some textual disagreement that I'm unaware of. But what I found by a Google search, I don't have my Greek New Testament next to me, is just the wrath.
Okay. So it's not its, but...
Yeah, and typically in Greek, there's a lot of times when the article "the" is used, but you wouldn't translate it in English as "the" because the word "the" is a little more definite in English than it always is than it often is in Greek. So in this case, he doesn't mean not only to avoid the wrath. It's just to avoid wrath. That would be like the most straightforward.
Yep, and that's the way that the NASB renders it, is not only to avoid wrath, but also to and so that's the way that it is there. But yeah, so that in the same way in verse 2 it says, the one who resists will incur judgment, but it doesn't specify whose judgment you're incurring per se. And so you kind of have to do a little bit of interpretive work to figure out whose judgment it is. The same thing is happening here. It's not only to avoid wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And now we got to figure out, well, whose anger, whose wrath is it that we are avoiding by being in subjugation? Depending on which translation you read, there's actually pretty big disagreement about this. So the New English translation actually renders it the wrath of the authorities, and the NIV and the NLT both sort of point at it being the wrath of the authorities indirectly by saying, to avoid punishment, or to avoid like its wrath, I guess is the way that it renders it there. But I'm inclined to say that this also, again, is referring specifically to the wrath of the authorities, or principally to the wrath of the authorities. And that's because this is just following the same pattern of what we've seen through the whole section, that Paul is really primarily concerned with kind of the temporal results of the things that we do. So this is, it's, leave space for God's wrath. And in that context, it's about the temporal God's wrath of being punished for your wrongdoing. And before it's, I would argue that it's incur judgment, it's incur the authorities' judgment because they will judge you for resisting them. And in the same case here, I'd say it's the same sort of idea that, you should be in subjugation not only to avoid wrath, the authorities' wrath, that it's like if you're not in subjugation to the authorities, they're going to be mad at you. Like, that's kind of the idea that we see here.
Hot take. So what if it is referring to the wrath of God, but it's using it in the sense of the chapter 12 statement of leaving it to the wrath of God? So what if,
sure.
Yeah. So, and this is why the ESV translating it this way is so stupid. Sorry, I keep using the word stupid today. It's really bad. It's a bad translation. There's no reason to throw the word gods in there. Just keep it at wrath, because then it's ambiguous, which is what it is in the Greek. Right. So it should be ambiguous to let the English reader decide, right? So
yes, and I would say I think that it's intentional to be ambiguous. It's not that because there is kind of this connection between the wrath of the authorities and the wrath of God in the whole section of, they're appointed by God, they're God's avenger, to enact his wrath against wrongdoing. And so when you get this to avoid wrath, it's like, I think you're right that it is God's wrath, but it's mediated specifically in this context as the anger of the authorities. Like it's in time, them having wrath against you for resisting them or not being in subjugation to them.
It's the wrath of the authorities carrying out the wrath of God on the wrongdoer in instances where the wrongdoer is in fact the wrongdoer.
Yes.
And so so this would be a case of I agree with the interpretation they're going for, and that I think Paul does have the wrath of God in mind, as well as it's the authorities carrying out the wrath of God, right?
Yes.
But that's way too much interpretation in my translation.
Yes. Just leave it. Let people interpret it.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes you see these things, man, the ESV has betrayed me. Usually it's the NIV that betrays me, but
right.
But I just think this is bad. I don't think you need to do this. And it's both verses 4 and 5, by the way. Both of them don't say God's wrath. They just say wrath. And
I missed the one in verse 4. Okay.
It's the same. It's the same deal. Yeah. And both of them, it just says wrath. I just double checked that. It's
Sure.
like,
So it says,
ESV,
verse 4 is, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out wrath on the wrongdoer.
An avenger for wrath. Yeah, I can't, there's some details in the Greek. It doesn't all translate word for word in the English there. I don't know what carries out is, for example. But the point being, God's wrath is not the phrase, it's just wrath. Right. So, I still love you, ESV, but this might be one to fix.
Yeah.
In your constant revisions.
Yes, but you led me astray, ESV.
Yes.
Right. So that's the first one, of avoiding wrath, avoiding anger. So it's like in the first case of be in subjugation to the rulers, because they're powerful and you don't want powerful people mad at you. Just in one case, and second of all, because like they're also carrying out God's wrath on wrongdoers, and so if you're doing wrong, like they're going to punish you for it. So it's better not to resist in that sense, because you don't want powerful people angry at you. Basically don't poke the bear is kind of the idea here. And then the other one is but also for the sake of conscience. And here is I think kind of looping in it's bringing in the moral idea again, that it's good to be in subjugation to rulers. Is that's basically what the text is saying. How does that sit with you, Jeremy?
It sits well. I like where we're at.
Great.
Yep.
So I have a question. So having kind of settled the exegetical question of let's just go through the text and see what it says, I have some questions for you. And then it sounds like you also have some topics you want to talk about too. So the question that I have for you is, I want to bring back the lens that we were using. Well, actually I would say, it's time for the other meat. Thank you. So in our our first episode in this series, we kind of brought this like lens for how we can think about authority structures, husbands and wives, fathers and children, slaves and masters, where it's this notion that like authority is something that is derived. And we get all of these really interesting passages, particularly in Paul, where he does these things of husbands do this thing, wives do that thing, and it's always these asymmetric commands that we get, like fathers don't exasperate your children, and children obey your parents, and so it's like the command is asymmetric, that the one in authority doesn't get the same commands as the one who's not in authority, and so the question that I have for you is, in this situation, Paul is using the same idea of derived authority. So this is an authority structure that we have here of rulers and the people who are being ruled. But, and we get a bunch of commands to us as the people who are being ruled. But we don't get any commands that Paul is giving to the actual ruler in this case. And so my question is, maybe as an exercise, let's, like, if Paul was writing this in the same form as a husbands do this, wives do this format, we have the quote unquote the commands to the wives in this whole section of these 5 verses here. But what are the commands to the ruler, that are kind of implicit in this section here? Does my question make sense?
Totally. Yeah, I love it. And I think the reason why Paul doesn't include that here is because he's not writing this letter to any of such people.
Yeah, like Caesar was not part of the church in Rome at this period.
Right. I mean, you might have had a centurion or something. I mean, you do see examples of prominent rulers, like centurions and stuff, embracing the faith. That's not quite the same. That's actually not quite the same thing, though. Even a centurion who might have some military prowess is not like a provincial ruler. Right. Much less Caesar. So I think that's probably the reason you don't see this kind of stuff there. And I would say, like, I think it is embedded in the passage, though. Don't be a terror to good conduct. Be a terror to bad conduct. I think that's exactly, like, again, and that's what I mean by it when I say the generally / the ideal, right? Yeah. Even though it's not probably the main thing Paul is thinking when he wrote that, I do think it does serve as an ideal, right? That's the whole point. You are supposed to terrorize evildoers, meaning judicial punishment, right? Right. And you are supposed to reward in some sense the good, which I don't think necessarily has to mean you give a key to the city to every person who helps an old lady across the street. I just think it means that you allow the structure to exist, which provides for human flourishing, and provides baked in rewards, we might say, to those who do good. So for example, not burdening families who want to have children. That'd be a really great way to reward those who do good. So I think it's embedded there in the passage, but I would also just say Scripture is replete with examples of wickedness and what it looks like to terrorize good conduct if you're a ruler, particularly in the Old Testament. So even though Paul doesn't address the rulers like he does wives, children, and masters, or wives, children, and slaves, rather, I think there's a huge context to Paul's thinking and the thinking of any Christian who knows the Old Testament here, and we reference the story of Ahab and Jezebel and the vineyard of Naboth, right? When we did our first part of this series. And that's a good example of like taking people's property. You might be able to get away with that if you're a ruler, but that's wickedness, right? That's something not to do. Being, in the same way that a father could exasperate his children, you could exasperate your subjects with heavy, burdensome taxes. You could destroy people's life savings by inflating the heck out of the currency and, destroy the elderly and what they've saved up for, right? You could, etc. We could go down a laundry list of grievances I may or may not have. But the point being, terrorize evildoers. Don't be a terror to those who are doing good. I guess I would say that leave people alone, let people do good things, and until they step out of line, which I'm defining here as like, doing wickedness, not just not wearing a mask to the grocery store or whatever. When they step out of line, then punish them. Right. And so this goes into the topic I wanted to bring up, this idea of anarcho-tyranny, which is a phrase that's probably unfamiliar to everyone listening. It's hopefully not. Hopefully it becomes more well-known because it's a great term, coined by a writer, Sam Francis, I think in the 90s or the 80s. I can't remember. It's a few decades ago. He was a political writer. And anarcho-tyranny is this fascinating concept, and it might sound familiar to any of you who have been paying any attention to what's been going on in the last 21 months since March 2020. The concept is essentially that you have an extremely powerful, overweening state that terrorizes and tyrannizes its subjects by refusing to punish evil, but vociferously punishing ordinary people who are just trying to live life, right? So the anarcho part is allowing rampant looting and arson and violence to remain unchecked in the streets, telling the police to stand down. It's like, what the heck are they good for if they can't stop rioters, right? These kinds of things. That's the anarcho part. It's just anarchy, in the sense of chaos is kind of, what it means, refusing to punish evildoers. And then the tyranny part is like people who want to run their private business, being forced to comply with all sorts of absurd mandates. And then after just barely scraping by, a bunch of arsonists come and burn their building down. And nobody in the government is interested in finding who those people are and prosecuting them. But instead, some kid who defends himself against rioters and arsonists and looters gets put on the stand to defend himself. And I'm referring to Kyle Rittenhouse here, right? Someone who's clearly acting in self-defense is on the stand being prosecuted for no reason, whereas his assailants, who were there to cause damage and who tried to kill him, two of them he shot and killed, but the third one he only wounded, right? That guy's still alive. The prosecution in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, has not pressed any charges against that third guy who's still alive, who was there causing damage. They know who he is. He's on camera doing evil things, and they're not interested in him, right? They're interested in this guy who defended himself. So that's anarcho-tyranny. That's in a nutshell. Kyle Rittenhouse, the fact that he was in that situation, that's anarcho-tyranny, the best way to describe it. And so this is what I meant earlier when you were saying, like, you know, all this stuff about, like, well, generally rulers don't want chaos. It's like, well, in some cases it's politically advantageous to cause chaos. They do this for a reason. So there's my idea that I've thrown out. I think it is a valid concept in political science, this anarcho-tyranny. And I think we're living in it right now, in at least when it comes to the cities of America. Although I guess Kenosha is not some huge city, right? But you also see it in things like, you know, people who were at the riots on January 6th at the Capitol, right? Who were just there. Like, they entered the Capitol building, but they didn't, like, attack anybody. They weren't violent. They didn't, some people there were violent, but there were some people there who just kind of entered the Capitol building and loitered, right? And those people were like, there was a massive campaign to hunt these people down and find out who they were and throw them in prison, you know, just for loitering in the Capitol, which, even if it is a crime, it's not really, like, evil, you know? And so there's been this massive campaign to root these people out and punish them and make these political show trials of them. And it's like, meanwhile, we have, like, so much footage of these riots last summer, and almost none of these people who were burning down buildings and kicking old men in the face until they bleed, like, all this absurd stuff. We have tons of video footage of it. Zero effort whatsoever to bring these people to justice. You know, it's like, there's none of it. There's no efforts whatsoever. So anarcho-tyranny is a real thing right now. And I think it does present a really difficult question when it comes to how should we as Christians handle it when the government clearly is a terror to good conduct and not a terror to bad conduct. It's the exact opposite of what Paul says rulers are/ought to be. What do we do in that situation? Does some form of vigilantism become okay? Like, I don't actually know what to think about this, right? I know I'm kind of rambling here, and I do want you to jump in here. But for example, there's another thing that's been on my mind lately is, like, how lightly our government punishes pedophiles, which scripturally, the death penalty, clearly, because rape gets the death penalty. Mm-hmm. And pedophilia is an especially egregious form of rape. So, like, okay, I just read in the news today that Josh Duggar was convicted of some really, really disgusting things. I won't talk about what they are, but pedophilia, essentially. And he got, like, 19 years in prison. And I just read that, and I'm like, why? Kill him. Like, what are we doing here? Why? I just think it's absurd. Like, you know,
it's like not even life. Like,
what? He's not safe to ever be around in society again with what he did. And by the way, one of the people Kyle Rittenhouse shot was a pedophile. Why was he on the streets? Why was he not executed? This is absurd. Like, and even if you're against the death penalty, okay, why is he not in prison for life? Okay. Obviously, we've made our position on the death penalty clear on this podcast. But if you don't go for that, okay, fine. Why is he on the streets? Somebody who would harm children in that way is not a safe individual to ever have just roaming the streets ever again. You know, and I don't know, especially when it's this egregious thing. It's not like, I don't know. It's not like some much more mild sexual offense, I guess, is my point. It's like a really, really serious thing with, like, you know, young children. And so it's been on my heart lately, and I've just been burdened. Like, what the heck are we doing? Why is this allowed to, this is such a miscarriage of justice, and it's anarcho-tyranny is what it is. So, okay, I've ranted long enough. Please.
Yes, well, I mean, So the thing that comes to mind about this is, so I'm gonna make a little bit of a pitch here, and I'm curious about your thoughts, and that is that if it is if we understand God's wrath to be in this context some kind of like temporal punishment that's like rendered to wrongdoers in that case, and then I'll like also loop in that maybe let me circle back first and say I think I totally agree with you about the question that I started asking of like what are the implicit commands to rulers in this case. And I mean, I think you're right. The implicit command is exactly do that thing of reward good and be a terror to evil, and that when you have a ruler who is not doing that thing, then they are the wrongdoer in this case. And so I guess my question is, what does it then look like for the wrath of God to be brought against this particular ruler?
Whew, that's a good way to turn it around, I think. Because the Protestant reformers dealt with this, right? That's why they developed the doctrine of the lesser magistrate.
Mm-hmm.
And so, which is not so much a doctrine, even though it's called that, as it is a political theory of how Christians ought to operate in their own context, which is different than ours. And their idea was basically, well, a lesser ruler can oppose the one that's higher up on behalf of the lesser ruler's subjects. And because that lesser ruler is supposed to keep order, is supposed to reward good and punish evil. So in order to do that, a lesser ruler might have to oppose one that's higher up. And that actually is that idea is sort of what America was founded on, like the 10th Amendment whole thing. I mean, we don't follow that anymore, but we could, like Ron DeSantis is kind of doing it over in Florida. Like, you can't just say, forget you guys, we're going to not do that here.
If you don't like Ron DeSantis, I mean, that's also exactly what like Colorado and Washington have done with their laws around marijuana use. They basically just told the Fed to stuff it, and like, right, yeah. Like, well, what are you gonna do, right?
Yeah, it's a good principle because it keeps things away from pure vigilantism, but it also allows resistance in cases where it's justified.
Yes, and I think that what works about that is it is working inside of the authority system that, again, Paul tells us God has instituted. And so I'd say, it's incumbent upon the lesser rulers who have also been appointed by God to basically not neglect their responsibility, even if the people in higher authority than them are, not neglecting, but are there's a fancy word for it that's not coming to me right now. But it basically, if they're violating their responsibilities, then like that doesn't get you out. Like you're not off the hook. It's still up to you to do to dispense your responsibility well before God. Basically, is the maybe what I was building to right there.
Yeah. Well, I think there's got to be a gray area there too, and I think there's definitely something here to be said for the point we've already made in this series, which is that the Bible doesn't prescribe any one form of political arrangement. Right. And a lot of this has to be decided and figured out using Christian principles and biblical, data, we might say, to respond to the situations around us, which is what Martin Luther and the rest of the reformers did when they developed the idea of the lesser magistrate. It's what Christians did when they just, figured out how to handle persecuting governing authorities in Rome all the way back in the day. And it's what happened when, not all of the revolutionaries were Christians, but many were in the American Revolution. And it's up to us to figure, it really is. It's up to us to figure out, this context is way different than those contexts. Like, we have the internet now, and that actually does substantially change things. Like, the American revolutionaries and the Protestant reformers and stuff, they didn't deal with such things as massive mega corporate media outlets that could, like, you know, and Twitter and I mean, politics is perception and information, right? So a lot of what's happening today is specific to our era. And so we have to figure out, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to navigate the world we live in? And there's not like an obvious answer to that. But just like grabbing a gun and going and like opposing the ungodly state, you're just going to get killed, right? And that's why I think there has to be some principle of, like, you don't just rush out there and attack you know, Joe Biden or whatever, you know. There has to be some understanding of, like, keeping things to the wrath of God and allowing the wheels of history to turn. If a ruler is truly evil, they won't last forever. Eventually, a people will rise up and overturn that ruler, and that's in God's providence. And guess what? Whoever replaces that ruler was appointed by God to do exactly that. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and there's actually some things here that I'd like to talk about too, because I think there are some encouragements to us as Christians for how we can live in a society that like is evil, you know, where and what we should be doing. And so I have two maybe encouragements for us to sit with here. I'm not sure if this is quite the milk, not solid food or not, but no, sorry. We're already in the other meat for application and discussion here. So we're good to go. So the first encouragement that I'd say is, and this is the check against, you know, libertarian Jonathan right here. And that is that I think one of the points that Paul is making here is that, like, resisting rulers is like something that you'll get punished for. And even if the ruler's bad, that doesn't mean you're not going to get punished for resisting them. And, you know, so that it's like it may still just be a terrible idea, even if you don't like what the ruler's doing and the ruler is unjust. Like, that ruler's still appointed by God and they still have this power. And so, and part of that, I would say, is in understanding that God has his purposes in the rulers that he has appointed. And so for that is that what I would say is that we shouldn't, as Christians, think ourselves like above persecution, or above being mistreated or wronged by people. You know, this is the beloved avenge not yourselves, but, you know, leave it to the wrath of God, or, you know, don't overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good. That just because we're being mistreated, just because, you know, the way that we would like things or prefer things is not what's happening, or even if, like, outright evil is being done against us, we're not entitled to not having that persecution, or we're not entitled to be being treated well by authority figures.
Even Christ, who didn't deserve it at all, didn't consider himself above the cross.
Yeah.
Right. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah, no, totally. And so part of that is, like, I think on the first case, we should just be encouraged that I think there's a lot as Christians that we should just bear. That, I mean, you know, if we're being persecuted, if we're being mistreated, I think there's a lot to just being mistreated. And for me, this one's really hard to swallow, because again, libertarian Jonathan is like, oh no, what this state is doing is wrong. What this state is doing is evil. Like, you know, what's in my heart is I want to resist that. Like, I want to, you know, like, oh, I don't want, you know, any piece of this. But, you know, like, my heart doesn't say, like, well, I should just, you know, accept being mistreated. But I think that that's a pretty big encouragement that Paul is giving to us of, you know, God's wrath is something that will be brought against wrongdoing. And so if wrongdoing is being done against you, like, God's going to handle that. and maybe you should just be persecuted, like, is, I think one of the conclusions that we can draw from this. How does that sit with you, Jeremy?
I agree. And I think one point of application here that I'll just throw in real quick that speaks to me, I think, is also that, like, we're not supposed to be scofflaws, which is like a great word that I love using whenever that's
it's perfect.
So good. Scofflaw. We're not supposed to be scofflaws, right? So I think there's an element where it's like, look, I could go on and on about theory about why it's stupid that the government builds the roads, right? But it's also kind of stupid to, like, argue with a police officer who pulls you over for going 10 over, right? Even if the speed limit is dumb and it shouldn't be the speed limit it is, there's definitely something, like, there's better hills to die on, so there's definitely a triumphalist kind of I hate the state kind of thing, which is not, I think, a Christian approach, and it's rife within libertarianism and conservatism, I think, and the people who have that attitude are often, like, 100% right about the theory of something. Like, yeah, your taxes are so stupid. Your taxes, if you live in America, your taxes are really stupid, like, and evil and wicked, right? But I think, and we're going to get into, this is a good bridge to the next episode. We're going to talk about taxation. Those of you who know Romans 13 well might wonder why we stopped at verse 5 when the next verse talks about taxes. It's next episode.
We're doing it next episode.
But it's like, okay, yeah, but ultimately all the money you have it because God gave it to you, right? It's not something you take with you into heaven, right? Into the heavenly dwellings with all the treasures there. So why not allow yourself to be defrauded rather than take up the sword and potentially lead to your own death and the death of many other innocent people over just money, right? So it's kind of like, even though money is huge, it's a dumb hill to die on, I think. Now, can it become, okay, like, none of this is objective and true in every circumstance. If the government starts taking 80% of your income, you should definitely take up the sword because you'll be starving.
What's the cutoff, Jeremy? What percentage should we take up the sword?
Like, I don't know. And even in that case, like, if you're a multi-billionaire, even though it's unjust, you can still eat, right? So possibly, not, but obviously if it's the sort of thing where you're being starved out by your government, Soviet style, then that would be an appropriate time to revolt and, start a civil war, and a lot of people would die. It might be necessary to keep the government from killing all the subjects anyways, So that's what I mean by this is complicated. But, I, generally speaking, to just fly off the handle and start attacking the IRS agent who shows up at your house and wonders why you haven't paid your taxes, probably not the most Christian approach. It's not very wise. You'll probably just get thrown in jail. And if you shoot that IRS agent, okay, great. Now there's a son and a wife, and who are now going to bed without their father and their husband, right? Some good you've done, right? I think that's also Jesus's point when he rebukes Peter for cutting off the ear of the person who's going to arrest him. It's just like, cool, you cut off his ear. There's like a bunch of soldiers here. Like, what do you think you're gonna do, right?
What was your follow-up, Peter? Like,
right, yeah, this is just folly. You're just mad and causing damage with no end goal, right? You're not actually accomplishing anything. So, and then of course Jesus points out that I could send down legions of angels and defend myself if I wanted to. Who are you, Peter? Anyway, so that's just kind of my spiel on, like, don't die on dumb hills. Literally or metaphorically.
Yes, and so there's a piece to that of or the like the notion of just war theory, is that, like, wars is this is Augustine Augustine? How are you supposed to say his name? I've heard it both ways.
Potato.
Okay, sure. I'll switch back and forth. Augustine's just war theory, right? That it's, wars can't be just unless they're, I forget all of the pieces to them, but it's like, it needs to be defensive.
You have to be able to win realistically.
Yes.
That's a key one.
Yeah. And that's the important piece, that it's like, if you fighting this war is just going to like have you and all of your, neighbors and friends and, all of the men die, then it's like, it's not a just war. Like, it doesn't matter if you were like, it doesn't matter if the other side started it and you would have been justified in like trying to defend yourself. The fact that you would all lose and everybody would die makes it bad, and you shouldn't do that. And so I would sort of apply that I think there's a just resistance theory, that we can apply to it, that resisting authorities is like, well, it's if it's a righteous thing that the authorities are enacting, then it's not just to resist it, But, and by token is like, and if even if it's a wrong thing, if by resisting it, the only thing that's going to happen is like, you're going to get like thrown in prison, and now like, who's going to take care of your wife, or, or you're going to get shot, and who's going to take care of your, like, if that's the only thing that's going to happen as a result of it, then again, that's not just resistance. That's just dumb.
It's unwise and in such an egregious way as to be sinful.
Yeah. And so I think that maybe that's the other side of it is there is this, I maybe argue, just resistance theory, where I think there are situations in which, in a strict sense, resisting authority is something that is like just and right. Maybe not in the way that Paul is meaning it in verse 2, but in, maybe a broader sense of what resisting authorities looks like. And if you disagree with me, then, I mean, like, what was the American Revolution like? Just like total evil? I
used to think that, believe it or not.
Oh, interesting.
At one point, when I was like 18.
Yeah. So I definitely. But you don't think that anymore?
No, I think it was based.
That's okay. Very nice. Well, okay, I guess I would say the majority of our audience probably does not think that the American Revolution was like abject evil. And so I would say, welcome to my position, and that is that it is okay sometimes to, quote, resist authorities.
Right. Well, and that actually kind of was, in some ways, just a tax revolt. That's right, the funny. Well, but I mean, there was more. There was more to it than that.
Yeah, it does kind of undercut your point.
That's why I'm like, oh, that's the libertarian in me conflicting with this passage. I'm like, oh, they killed a bunch of British people because they were mad about taxes. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So it's like, I can't help it. Like, I was born and raised here in America. It's the.
Sure, but. Yes, but I think that like one of the pieces with the American Revolution is it wasn't the case that like, oh no, they're just like the colonies are going to get totally wiped out and destroyed. And like, it's not like that was a foregone conclusion. And I mean, the fact that, we are an independent nation now, I think speaks to the fact that it was maybe, it might've been a long shot, but it's like not impossible that things turned out the way that they did. And so as a result, it's not like, I would say on the other side, if it was the case that like, Great Britain was just always going to totally crush the colonies if they revolted or something like that, then I would say it would be wrong for the colonies to revolt. And so that's sort of the piece that I'm trying to land in as the example for my proposed just resistance theory.
I think I agree. And I would also add as an addendum that because I mentioned like the coronavirus restrictions at the outset of this very long episode, we could tie a little bow on it and just say like, yeah, if someone's holding a gun to my head, I'll probably put the mask on. I have a son. Yeah. Right? I have a wife. I have a mom and a dad and brothers and, people who care about me, right? But the reality is the state doesn't have the resources to actually pursue its tyrannical mandates. Yeah. So the risk is pretty low of me rebelling against that, right? And even if they were to come down on me, it would be a fine, and I would pay the fine to avoid
you would incur
prison.
the judgment, and you would bear it.
I would incur the judgment of the God-appointed authority, and I would come home and say things that on a bad day would not be fully in line with Paul's restrictions on speech, which we've had a podcast episode about. And I would pay the dang fine. And I would say, I'm still not wearing my mask tomorrow.
And you would pay it the next day too.
I would pay it the next day too. So I think that this also goes back to my silly example of like the carton of eggs on your head, right? It's like, it's just pointless and dumb, you know? But if someone's holding a gun to my head, I'll probably do it until I can amass a sort of resistance, you know?
Yeah.
But I guess that's the way I would understand it. And so I personally see it as, if you want to speed in a speeding zone because you think the speed limit's kind of dumb and you're just, you know, evaluating yourself and you're like, why is the speed limit so arbitrarily low here? I don't see what's dangerous about it. And in all your conscience, you know, think it's okay morally to go faster. I don't think it's sinful to do that. I do think it's sinful if you get pulled over to give the officer the hardest time of their life about it or to refuse to pay your fine, because that's dying on a stupid hill, if that makes sense. That's how I would understand this. Like, you don't have to obey every little thing the government says, but you should be conscious if you're doing it. Like, you might incur judgment, right? And you got to be conscious of that and wise, you know. So I guess that's my way of saying that. It's like, I don't know, I've heard people say it's like a sin to drive over the speed limit, and it's like, well, they won't even stop you unless you're going 5 over. And I don't actually think it's a sin to go 6 over necessarily. But if you get pulled over, you get pulled over. That's the risk you take, you know. I don't know, that's the way I would parse it out.
Yeah, interesting.
All right, this is a super long episode, dude. I mean, I knew it was going to be such a big
for
passage.
Sure. Well, I think maybe we can wrap up there for this time. We gave a little bit of a teaser at the end for taxation, which we're gonna get to in the next episode. We can decide if taxation is in fact theft or not, and you know what a Christian response to taxation should be. Maybe just to whet everybody's appetite for what's coming in the future.
You should be really mad about it. That's the. You should stage a revolt and throw tea into the harbor.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Definitely that one. That is the righteous action.
Or should you just render unto Caesar, right? Like Jesus said. Stay tuned and find out.
Well, in the immortal words of the philosopher Porky Pig, that's all, folks. We thank you for joining us. If anything you heard today has sent you into a blind theological rage, feel free to lambast us on social media. Alternatively, if you liked what you heard, have Bible verses you want us to break down, or questions you think we can answer, you can send them to thejohn315podcast@gmail.com. That's thejohn315podcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.